NATO says Kyiv is burning through artillery shells much faster than Western countries can produce them. It's a trend that has left many Allied stocks badly depleted. Here to dig into this challenge, retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie previously served as Commander and Chief of Staff of the Canadian Army. He's now a Senior Associate at Blue Sky Strategy Group. David Perry is the President and a Senior Analyst at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me.
Good to talk to you.
General Leslie, I'd like to start with you if I could. Ukraine is burning through artillery shells faster than the West can produce them. How concerning is that for you?
Very concerning. The Ukraine, of course, has its at roots the method of fighting against essentially the German army of many decades ago. And in that instance, firepower was seen as the solution with which to smash the enemy forces. Unfortunately, they are burning through ammunition at a staggering rate, up to 10 to 12,000 shells per day, and the NATO stocks are getting depleted.
So they're using outdated tactics? Is that your sense on the battlefield, and that's why they're burning through their reserves so quickly?
I would hesitate to embrace that idea fully. Let's realize that the Ukraine is now the most combat experienced army in the world vis-a-vis modern warfare. And of course, they've been fighting a savage fight against the Russians since 2014, and of course, the latest invasion of last year. So they're substituting artillery firepower for conventional maneuver forces because they don't have a lot of those, i.e. the requests for tanks. So it's all part of a wickedly complex problem. And quite frankly, from the Ukrainian Ukraine point of view, I'm absolutely sure that they would rather expend artillery ammunition than their soldiers' lives.
Well, no, that's certainly a fair trade-off, and thanks for clarifying that for me. So Dave Perry, according to NATO, we're talking about an ammunition shortage. We're not talking about bullets. We're talking about the artillery shells. It's gone. Large caliber ammunition wait time has increased from 12 months to 28 months. How can the Western defense industry ramp up so that Ukraine doesn't run out of these shells?
Well, hopefully quickly, because it's not just these shells, it's a lot of different types of production, which Western defense industries in Canada and the United States and in Europe collectively just aren't really calibrated to produce to support this tempo and type of conflict. So the general was talking about, there's different views about exactly how Ukraine is fighting, but I think one way to look at this is that this is an example of a potential future conflict for an industrial state power like this. So people talk about us being back to an era of great power competition. Great power competition looks a lot more like this kind of conflict with this type of rate of ammunition than, say, the last 20 or 30 years of fighting in the Middle East did.
So what does the defense industry need then to be able to ramp up and start meeting this demand, this tempo, as you've described it?
Partnership with government to work out, quantities, production schedules, getting contracts in place, likely financing in part, recognizing that, you can't just go on the open market or go to Home Depot and pick this stuff up. So you need to have government orders to actually have this ammunition in place. And I think in a lot of cases, we don't have enough production capacity, and those companies don't have enough staff. So they're likely going to have to scale up quite significantly. And I think the best way for us to do that would be to work in partnership with our allies in the United States especially, but in the rest of Europe, because this is actually something where Canada can meaningfully make a significant contribution both to Ukraine, but to the wider NATO alliance.
So General Leslie, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. is working on tweaking the Ukrainian military tactics. He didn't call them outdated, he didn't use my word, but essentially focusing on changing those tactics from relying so heavily on those artillery barrages. Is that the answer here? Is that a viable option given the human capacity that Ukraine is dealing with as well?
It's going to have to be an option because the stocks are what they are. In Canada's case, we were a bit low before the start of the war, and everyone is desperately short right now. When I use desperately, I'm not overstating. From the Ukraine point of view, they've had to use that firepower to blunt the Russian attacks, and with very good effect. They've killed, as we know, tens of thousands, multiple tens of thousands of Russians. But it's not stopping them. And if I may, strategically, this points to the bigger question of how long does NATO now think this war is going to go on? And it's fairly obvious that it's going to go on for a long time. Look, either way, the Russian bear, if it wins, and I don't think it will, but if they win, they'll probably keep going. They'll do something else equally disastrous, savage. And if they lose, we'll have an angry, sullen bear, which will be not a reliable partner for peace. So it's wise to ramp up now because deterrence, of course, is cheaper than the war, and it takes a long time, as Dr. Perry pointed out, to actually get production facilities up and running to the wartime levels that are now becoming the norm.
You mentioned you just gave a strategic analysis, but I wonder, General Leslie, tactically, what would a change in Ukraine's approach look like on the battlefield compared to what they're doing now with the heavy reliance on artillery?
Well, to be able to maneuver on a modern battlefield, you have to have a certain amount of air defense to keep the drones, helicopters, and aircraft off your back. You've got to have artillery fire to suppress the enemy. And also, most recently, over the last 15 to 20 years, you have to have precision guidance in the shell systems or rockets or missiles, and as well an ability to see where the rounds are landing, which you now do through drones. So you have to get smarter technology, so it's one or two shots that kill instead of multiple hundreds that just explode uselessly in a field. So that reduces consumption. On the other hand, they need armor, they need tanks, they need protected vehicles to maneuver when other people are shooting at them, because they won't be able to suppress the Russians to keep their heads down using artillery fire with the same numbers of shells as before.
Dave Perry, what's your take on that one?
I would just build on that to say that, I mean, they need all of these things in large scale quickly. So if we want them to not be using as many rounds of artillery ammunition in the short term, we need to expedite the delivery of the tanks that have been, in lots of cases, including Canada's, they're committed. We've got them over to Poland. There's only 4 of them, and they're in Poland. They're not so useful on the battlefield unless they can get over the border. And there's also a requirement, as the general was pointing out, they need to have protected mobility, so vehicles that can carry troops around on the battlefield and keep them relatively safe, or provide some firepower of themselves. And they have requirements that they've been calling for over the last several months for hundreds and hundreds of both infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and hundreds of tanks. And that equipment all isn't there yet. So I think the ability for them to tweak their tactics is going to be relatively finite until they get the rest of the equipment that they've articulated they need.
So, General Leslie, we sent 4 tanks from Canada, and it seems like the military had to dig deep to get those. The West has funneled a lot of military equipment over there and ammunition into Ukraine since the start of this. I mean, have Western countries sort of jeopardized their own combat readiness in exchange for helping Ukraine deal with Russia?
Some will argue that they have. I would not fully support that argument because it's country specific. In Canada's cases, we have 81 gun tanks. We've sent 4, mainly because we only had about 20 to 30 that worked because of lack of spare parts, because of lack of funding, and you're back into the wickedly complex problem of defense procurement. The Ukraine needs more of everything, and sending money is great, which Canada, by the way, is amongst the world leaders. Having said that, it needs more than money. Writing a check is not the end game, if you would, for ensuring that the Ukraine gets the resources they can win. Because as Dr. Perry's pointed out, the stocks have been depleted across the board. So we've got to make sure that we purchase equipment for the Ukraine as rapidly as possible, and also for the Canadian Armed Forces, because the Russian bear is going to be around for a while. That's the hidden message behind all these ramping up of stocks.
So Dave Perry, last May, General Wayne Eyre, he urged the Canadian defense industry to get on a war footing to respond to the ongoing crisis. Do you think that's happened? Do you think we're there?
I don't. Just last week, we saw a visit from Minister Nan, Minister Champagne down to Washington. I think I'm hoping that some of those conversations were oriented around getting us to that point, which would really require a collaborative plan between the government and the industrial manufacturing base to move up to higher levels of production. So I was saying earlier, I mean, the companies can't just flick a switch and go to triple production today. They need probably larger facilities in some cases. They need to hire more people, and you can't do that unless you have orders in place. So the government needs to work collaboratively, and I think the best way for us to do that is to work either with the United States solely or with the rest of the NATO alliance collaboratively to try and figure out amongst all the different allies how we can best produce the types of ammunition stock, small caliber ammunition, whatever it is, at a scale and pace that's relevant for modern conflict. Because I would take Ukraine as an indicator of what we can expect the future to look like, not our past experience in Afghanistan.
Okay, David Perry, Andrew Leslie, thank you so much for your insights today.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you.